Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you might be joining from. Welcome to the joint ERM and EMA Green Hydrogen Readiness webinar. Green Hydrogen Readiness, make the essential shifts now. I'm Justin Payne, partner with ERM, and I'm delighted to host the proceedings today. I'll introduce my fellow panelists a little bit later on. So just in terms of the agenda for this session, welcome to everybody, as I've just done. Look, I've got a short presentation, 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so. Then we'll introduce the panelists and then hopefully get into some very engaging Q&A on this very relevant topic. So just in terms of the housekeeping, really encourage some active participation today. So there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Please type them in at any time and we'll keep track of those, and we'll try and make sure we cover as many as possible as we can today. And at the end, as we said, we'll capture that during a discussion with our panelists. This webinar is being recorded for our own internal purposes, but a copy of this presentation will be made available to all those who have registered to attend. There is the ability to enable the English transcript feature down the bottom by showing subtitles for those that may need assistance with my accent. And if you do have any additional questions or thoughts, there is a short survey that we will facilitate at the end of the webinar for you to provide some feedback, and we can integrate that into potential future sessions. So just to get things rolling, it'd be great. We're going to pop up a quick polling question in a minute, but it would be good for us just to understand the makeup of the audience so that we can make sure that we try and tailor the questions that are most relevant. There's the poll. So if you could try and select the one that you think is most applicable, and if you can be in any of the top 4 categories, that would be great to give us a bit of a steer. But if you can't find your particular industry category there, please select others. Just give us 30 seconds or so. Okay, good mix. So lots of renewables interest, a bit of oil and gas, some finance and banking. And clearly we need to expand the selections so that we can capture you group who are in the others today. Sorry, let's put that down. Thanks for that. Just moving on. So I'm just going to run through a quick presentation to set the scene a little bit. There are some numbers and metrics in here. They're not intended to be extremely accurate. It's more to illustrate some of the size of the challenge here. And again, just to get us thinking a little bit about how we actually decouple and unlock this opportunity in green hydrogen. So a bit of the global landscape, talk a little bit specifically about Singapore because we are co-hosting this with the EMA. So there is a little bit of a Singapore relevance. Talk about the decarbonisation vectors and green hydrogen. I think most on the webinar will be familiar with green, but I'll talk about it briefly. Some of the use cases, and then the potential shipping vectors to understand what they could look like, and a little bit of thinking about the opportunities ahead. I guess, you know, this is not going to answer everyone's questions. This is more just a dialogue and get people thinking. Thanks, Beaufort. So if we just take a bit of a stand back view of the globe, and this is just looking at current hydrogen demand globally, it's about 90 million tonne per annum. And most of that is actually from conventional gas and coal sources, unabated. So that's I guess the size of the opportunity straight away for green hydrogen is how can we displace that current existing hydrogen demand. And despite all of the talk, we actually only have around 300 to 350 megawatts of electrolyser capacity installed, which is about 50,000 tonne per annum compared to the 90 million of non-green product. And if we look at the pipeline, so these data sets come from the International Energy Agency, there's about 3.2 gigawatts of projects currently that have reached FID globally. And yeah, it's same sort of scale up ratio. If they would all get into service by 2025 as scheduled, there's about 500,000 tonne that we would add to that 50,000 tonne. So again, lots of activity, but there's still a long way to go. And clearly, which is one of the key purposes of this session, the commercial competitiveness is the challenge. And on the bottom right-hand side there, the green bars on the right are essentially what the green hydrogen current cost per kilogram is compared to current conventional sources. Thank you. Next slide. So if we zoom in a little bit now and look at Singapore, the current emissions out of Singapore are 50 or 55 million tonne CO2 equivalent per annum, expecting to peak in about 2030 at about 65. And then the government has actually committed to net zero emissions target by or around mid-century of zero, essentially, from that peak in 2030. Really importantly, Singapore has 40% of the total emissions from electricity, and the remainder big industrial proportion of the total as well. And clearly, because of the nature of Singapore being an island state, the supply chains will need to be developed to actually trunk product into this geography. And again, very indicatively, it would take about 1 million tonne per annum of hydrogen to displace that power generation proportion. And 1 million tonne per annum is not insignificant when we were just looking at the slides before. Thank you. Next slide. So in terms of decarbonisation vectors, obviously green hydrogen is one of a number of currently proposed solutions to tackle this problem. The first one, more relevant to geographies that have relevant space, is direct electrification. So using renewables to displace currently non-renewable electricity in grids. Bit of a challenge in the Singapore context because of the space constraints. CCS also being explored. So capturing carbon at emissions point and then potentially shipping back to remote storage locations. So that's another one that is also being explored in and around Singapore. Green hydrogen, obviously the topic for today, produced in suitable geographies in places like Australia, where we have lots of renewables available, packaged and shipped to faraway markets potentially. And then last but not least, biofuels as an opportunity. And there may be a sort of synthetic methane vector there that could be considered. But today we're going to be talking about the green hydrogen element there, but just wanted to acknowledge that this is not considered the only solution out there, and there's lots of others also being actively investigated. Thank you. So the use cases, as we saw on the split of the CO2 emissions a little earlier, Singapore does have a large hydrogen as a molecule requirement, and it's something in the order of 500,000 tonne per annum. So that's separate to the million tonne I was mentioning earlier. This is 500,000 of hydrogen requirements for current industrial processes. So things like the oil refining activity and chemical manufacturing that we have in and around Singapore. And the selection of the actual end use case may actually determine the most appropriate supply chain. And I'll talk a little about the supply chain vectors that are currently under investigation in a slide or two. But that use case is quite an important part here for current and potential future uses. For electricity, obviously we've got fuel cells as a current source, but not at scale. And then further down the track, hydrogen and ammonia, direct combustion in modified gas turbines, but very much low technology readiness level for the moment. Also interesting for Singapore is the potential to use bunker fuel switching to ammonia for marine engines, and that obviously is a big opportunity for the Singapore context with the very high intensity of marine traffic coming in and out. And then obviously the scale of all this is really important when we work out what sort of supply chain might need to be deployed, and aggregation of end users is an important bit of that too. Thank you. So super quickly, the three main hydrogen shipping vectors currently being discussed: liquid hydrogen, ammonia, and liquid organic hydrocarbons. One of our panelists is actually active in liquid organic hydrocarbons, so I'll be talking a bit more about that in detail a short while later. Also importantly, and I think this is actually something to consider, is how do we actually ship it and convert it? So if the end use needs to be hydrogen, liquid hydrogen obviously gets it to end use place in the form of hydrogen, but both ammonia and liquid organic hydrocarbon carriers would need dehydrogenation and or cracking to get it back into elemental hydrogen for end use. And that actually has, if you like, an energy penalty at destination. So any associated energy requirements for that would need to be built into those supply chains on top of the basic requirement of the hydrogen. And it is worth mentioning that there's a number of MOUs to explore all of those options into Singapore, as well as a number of MOUs talking about end use cases, things like modified gas turbines. Thank you. So the supply chains, and this is, I think, really importantly, there's a lot of activity around development of mega scale, gigascale projects, particularly in geographies like Australia. But the economics to actually get that up will be very challenging at the moment, with probably without some government support to act as a catalyst. And hopefully in the discussion later, we can hear a bit about what's going on more globally. Industry collaborations, so actually understanding the production, supply chain, storage and in-use technologies, how we actually get governments to incentivise investments. And it may be, you know, even though it's a long way away from where we are speaking today, the US Inflation Reduction Act has caused a very big shift, even in the last number of weeks, for everybody because of their direct incentives for low carbon hydrogen production. And that needs to be considered by any and all geographies because it will influence who might take a first leading position in particularly the export market. And then we obviously need to take a longer-term view on how hydrogen will intersect with all of the other potential options out there. So yeah, a little bit of an illustration in the top there, talking about supply scaling, making sure that we have demand at the other end. But I guess the key bit there in green is that this supply chain piece has been somewhat undiscussed so far. So lots of talk about end use, lots of talk about production, but yeah, it's supply chain movements at scale maybe will be something that we get into a little bit later. So being talked about theoretically, but when we actually think about shifting 1 million tonne just into Singapore, the supply chains that we would require are somewhat larger than we have technology to deliver today in some cases. And I guess most importantly is that clearly all of this is predicated upon green hydrogen. And so tracking of shipments or tracking of sources as low carbon will need to be made sure that, there's a clear scheme around that. And I've just referenced there the Certify European example there. And yeah, just on the right-hand side there, there's a few industrial MOUs that have been announced. The top one there is talking about LOHCs. The middle one's talking about liquid hydrogen, and the bottom one there is talking about ammonia-fired gas turbines. So again, it's not intended for you to have to try and read that very small print, just to illustrate that there's a lot of activity out there in the market. Thank you. So bringing this section to a wrap so we can get into the more engaging discussion. The supply chain development, as we said, is a bit of a gap in the current strategy. Most of the focus today is on production and a little bit more on end use. Certainly an opportunity for certain organisations and geographies to take the lead in thinking about how they take a position in the market here. And it's fair to say across APAC, Singapore, especially the sort of island nations like Singapore, South Korea and Japan are all very active here because of that challenge of space for self-generation of renewables. End-use applications are a really important part here. But having said that, there may be particular customers or customer groups that would be willing to pay a premium to get this kick-started. Governments can play a role through policy that de-risks, and hopefully we'll also have a bit of discussion on that very shortly on some of the mechanisms in other geographies that are already being applied. And yeah, making the essential shift now is actually just making sure that that supply chain opportunity is unlocked. And there needs to be pretty close coordination because it's certainly not something that a single organisation could lead on their own. So that should wrap up. Hopefully we're going okay for time on the session so far. So what we might do now, just to actually help us think a little bit about the questions that we might get into, is ask another poll. And in your view, you can only select one. What do you think is the #1 challenge to resolve the kickstarting of green hydrogen? We can flick up the poll there. Production costs, supply chain, government policy, I think you've all seen those, end user, green credentials. So let's see. Oh, a mix, that's good, because it means that we can talk about lots of topics in the Q&A. So production costs, supply chain, government policy, all up there. End user application, interesting. And green credentials, I guess, potentially there's an implicit suggestion that that will come anyway. Excellent, okay. Let's get into the good bit. So let's just start by introducing the panelists, my fellow panelists. So starting from the top there, I've already introduced myself. Louis joins us from Element Energy, an ERM Group Company. He's dialing in this morning at the very early hours from the UK. So thank you, Louis, for joining. He's a senior consultant specialising in supporting the development of hydrogen projects in Europe. And he's currently looking at the next generation of electrolyser projects in the EU and the development of hundreds of megawatts of electrolysers, providing an understanding of their support mechanisms, development progress and barriers to their realisation. So really good background there for the discussion and bringing in more of a global context. We also have Tohru Hayashi-san joining us. He's normally based in Tokyo, but he happens to be dialing in from also an early hour of Germany. So thank you, Hayashi-san, for joining at this early hour. He leads and drives large-scale infrastructure projects in various sectors across the globe. In particular, he's currently looking at development of the liquid organic hydrocarbon carrier using the Sphera hydrogen technology being developed by Toyota. Prior to joining Mitsubishi, he worked for the IFC to provide financial solutions for the infrastructure projects in the developing countries across APAC. And finally, we have Jia Long, who will be joining us from Singapore. He's part of the National Energy Transformation Office at the EMA, and he's coordinating the efforts across a range of whole of government sectors to work out how to produce, transport and use energy transition activities. He works with a number of public sector agencies and private sector companies on the introduction and adoption of hydrogen and its derivatives, especially focused on the power sector, including the development of plans and policies, as well as R&D. Prior to joining the EMA, he spent time in the private sector and has joined us after getting an MSc in environmental management from NUS. So please welcome my fellow panelists. We might get straight into it and ask a couple of questions just to get the ball rolling. And then please, as we said at the start, please feel free to start popping in any questions you may have into the Q&A. And I'll try and make sure that we can capture those as we move through the discussion. So maybe, why don't we start with you, Louis, and just have a bit of a feel for what you see going on in Europe and any key green hydrogen initiatives that you think we should be thinking about down here in APAC. And just if you can share any current progress and learnings to date. Louis.
Sure. Thank you for the presentation to set things up, Justin. It's quite a broad question. I'll touch a couple of points. Maybe if there's interest in me talking about more, like pop a question in the chat. I'm happy to talk about anything to do with Europe. So kind of a little bit of context in what has happened in Europe. I'm sure you're probably aware that in maybe it's a couple of years ago, about 2020, Europe released a hydrogen strategy, kind of a long-awaited hydrogen strategy, that set significant ambition for getting hydrogen going in Europe and set out a roadmap to 2030 with a target of 40 gigawatts of electrolysis in Europe by that point. That set various things in motion. One thing that has been set in motion is the European Parliament and European Commission steadily increasing those targets since that date due to various external factors. But that kind of set in motion a whole range of funding sources and policy incentives for hydrogen that is now translating into the first hundreds of megawatt scale electrolyzers. So I've been supporting a few of them with techno-economic analysis and funding applications and working through the policy space. What's interesting is that kind of what has allowed major companies now to start making big announcements of, you'll see many announcements of gigawatt scale electrolyzers, hundreds of megawatt scale electrolyzers, is kind of the confluence of the availability of CapEx funding, kind of long-term targets, like you may have heard of the Renewable Energy Directive, Fit for 55, Repower EU. All of these announcements keep on ramping up targets, saying, I think currently the number is that 50% of hydrogen use in industry by 2030 will be required to be green, and 5.7% of road transport fuels will need to be a renewable fuel of non-biological origin, hydrogen being a key option there. Which means that the sector kind of has this visibility of, okay, there's these huge targets by 2030, which means that if we invest now, even though it's painful because of the price, I noticed a lot of people noting the price, we can get over the early pain. We might not be making money from these early projects. We'll take advantage of the funding that's available, be it CapEx funding, be it contracts for different type schemes to get the early project going. But I know by 2030, if I build 200 megawatts, 400 megawatts, now kind of meaning 2025 to 27 timescale, given the time it takes to plan and build these things, I'll have benefits to follow on. And I think that's kind of a key learning. It's not just the funding available now, it's the visibility that is beneficial, because early hydrogen projects, as the technology scales up, are expensive. And there isn't a business case without the funding. Sometimes with the funding, it's a squeeze. You need to know that there's going to be benefits further down the line. It's going to be an important part of the strategy. Perhaps I'll pause there. I've spoken a little bit. There's more I could say, and I'll let some other panelists.
That's great. Thanks, Louis. And don't worry, I'm going to come back to you because I do have a couple of things I've noted down that I want to follow up on there in terms of opportunities for us to leverage some of the things that you've done up there. Might throw to you next, Jia Long, about coming from an energy authority perspective. We sort of talked about in your bio some feasibility studies that have been done. Just interested in your insights in what you think might be able to help us shape the acceleration here.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things we've seen when we look closely at hydrogen for the past couple of years is how the timelines are converging around the late 2020s, early 2030s. So it seems like a lot of the projects and supply chains that are being surfaced to us all land around the 2027, 2030 period to be operationalized. So if you work backwards from this timeline and take into consideration the time it needs to build and set things up, it means that the decision to press the button on a lot of these hydrogen projects is within the next couple of years. So what I want to get to is that there is a lot of momentum being built up around hydrogen, particularly in the past couple of years. And I think we are getting the sense that we are on the cusp of something big, and a lot of announcements are being made this year to kick off the global hydrogen supply chain.
No, thanks. That's really useful. And don't worry, I'll also come back to you because I've also made some notes there and follow up. But let's keep it rolling. So Hayashi-san, obviously we talked a little bit about Sphera. It would be great if you could give us a little bit more of an insight as a key industry player here in the supply chain and what you think are the most important factors for us to start to make this shift happen.
Sure. Thanks, Justin. So yes, I am from Mitsubishi Corporation, and as Justin mentioned earlier, we are so Mitsubishi. As a Mitsubishi, we do multiple approach to this decarbonization field, but especially our team is focused on the transportation side, utilizing Sphera technology. Sphera is basically a technology to transport hydrogen, combine toluene and hydrogen into methane in the supply side, and then we transport using the chemical tanker to the demand side, and then at the demand place we do the dehydrogenation process to extract hydrogen from MCH. Then we deliver that hydrogen to our customers. And we have been able to demonstrate the technical viability of this transportation process through the demonstration project back in 2020. So basically, technology is ready to be commercialized once we have a good, we can find a good off-takers who can commit, and also good suppliers who can also commit to provide us, to sell us the hydrogen. So coming back to your question, Justin, I think if I can mention one of the key challenges. I think it would be the clear rules or regulations, because many of the, I think that currently it is very difficult for many of the potential off-takers to make decisions because the rules of the market are not clear yet in many regions. And for example, what is green hydrogen? What would be the potential penalties if not meeting certain criteria? And especially as I explained, in order for us to implement the project, we will need to make a certain amount of investments that need to be recovered over the long-term contracts. So it is even more difficult for off-takers, potential off-takers, to make a decision based on
We'll just give it
so
a minute.
they also need to.
Sorry, Hayashi-san did indicate earlier he was dialing in from his hotel, so we do have a slight connectivity issue. We'll see if he comes back. Okay, so we might move on to another question. We'll come back to Hayashi-san. Hopefully we can resolve his little bit of technical challenge there. I might. Sorry, Hayashi-san. Maybe I'll throw back to Louis. I'm just interested because you mentioned that the fact that Europe in 2020 started to think about this and start to map out how this transition might look. Do you sense that because the EU is sort of one big block or body, that makes it easier than we might have here in APAC, where we have a whole bunch of different countries potentially jostling for position? And if so, do you have any suggestions for how we might be able to get a bit more of a coordinated approach in APAC?
Very good question. And one that I have a slightly mixed response to. One challenge that has been faced, and it kind of ties into something that was flagged up in one of your questions earlier, is that being such a big block, it takes quite a long time for policies to get through the European Parliament, eventually to go through the European Commission, be voted on by the European Parliament, which means, for example, our definition of green hydrogen, which was kind of sets what hydrogen is eligible for all of these policies and funding, hasn't yet been defined, which is quite a big challenge for the whole sector, because depending on exactly how you define green hydrogen, defines how you produce hydrogen, which kind of defines your whole production strategy. And while there are these projects announced to start in between 2025 2027 type timeframes, they still don't fully exactly know exactly how they will be producing hydrogen because this definition hasn't become clear. And that's through a mixture of the size of the European Commission, the various different voices, some industry lobbying to try and change that decision. There's lots of opinions. And I think that's an evidence of where that big grouping has caused some challenges. The flip side of that is there is a program called the Important Projects of Common European Interest, which is a scheme through which, in some ways, countries and projects across countries have been forced to collaborate. So in Europe, there's quite relatively strict state aid rules that limit the amount that individual countries can fund their projects to stop anti-competitiveness, someone running ahead of the rest of Europe. But in getting this Important Project of Common European Interest status, countries can fund their projects as much as they want. And that process, the whole hype was launched for hydrogen. They just said, we're going to accept some pan-European projects. And hundreds of projects across Europe from various countries submitted to that process have been forced to collaborate and knit themselves together into waves that make sense, which is to some level forced knowledge sharing, coordination, which is needed when you're starting to think about beyond your first project. You're starting to think about large-scale hydrogen infrastructure for storage, for moving it around Europe. There's now multiple gigawatts of projects talking to each other to help develop that infrastructure. So two flip sides. One is, because there's so many countries collaborating, it can lead to these large-scale knitted together projects, but it's the challenge, as I'm sure you're aware of coming to an agreement.
No, thanks, Louis. That's great. And that probably leads into a nice question for Jia Long about the supply chain and logistics. Obviously, Singapore being an island nation, there's going to be an element of import required here. I'm just wondering if you have, in your various studies, had a bit of a look at the various vectors and whether you have any opinions or views on liquid hydrogen versus ammonia versus LOHC or even pipeline hydrogen, I guess, for that matter, from near neighbours, and whether you'd like to be able to share some thoughts with us on likely import vectors in the short, medium and longer term.
Yeah, thanks, Justin, very much for the question. So I think you have covered pretty succinctly in the earlier slides that a country like Singapore has very limited options for renewable energy. So we don't have as much as we need. And based on the rules of physics, we will have to import some of that energy. And one of the ways we're interested in is, of course, hydrogen. So the Singapore government, we commissioned a study on the use and use applications of hydrogen a couple of years back, and we've released that in public. You can Google for it. We call it the KBR study. And it looks at the three vectors of hydrogen that were mentioned earlier, right? So liquefied hydrogen, ammonia, and LOHCs. So, and following that, we have been paying pretty close attention to these three carriers. So very broadly, I think what we can say is that LOHC, in particular MCH, is a little bit more developed. It's been demonstrated to work, so we know it technically is feasible and it works out. I think there are some news out there about the pilots on a shipment of liquefied hydrogen, but we haven't really heard a lot of details after that pilot. And ammonia is a hydrogen carrier that in a way is the most developed today, in the sense that it's been shipped around and there's a market for it and there's international trade. However, the full supply chain hasn't been demonstrated like, the way MCH has. We know it works because every node of it is being used commercially today, not necessarily for the power sector's end use case. And we haven't seen anyone really try to or successfully strung it together and demonstrated it. So that's what we think about for the three hydrogen carriers. But that said, it's a very interesting question and I think a problem that all of us are grappling with, because all those carriers, like in mentioned slides earlier, have their pros and cons, and the jury is still out on which one will take the lead in the near term, medium, and long term.
Thanks, Jia. I think maybe Hayashi-san, I might bring you back in. Hopefully your connection's okay. I'm just interested in your views around current assets and potential to repurpose. Obviously, we don't have at scale liquid hydrogen at all yet. As Jia just mentioned, we do have a little bit of ammonia for industrial purposes. Just wondering about LOHC and potential for, especially in the Singapore context, possibility to reutilize current oil supply chain assets.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Hope you can hear me now. So yeah, thanks, Jia, for giving us the context around how now Singapore is considering three carriers. So yes, as for LOHC, so I mentioned earlier that this technology has been demonstrated successfully. But in terms of the commercialization, or in terms of enabling the project, there are some advantages that LOHC has, and one of them is the utilization of the existing facilities or the infrastructure. And so, because we are because we are using toluene and MCH as a carrier of hydrogen, and those chemical substances are not too difficult to handle. It requires certain consciousness, but it's manageable. We will be able to utilize the existing facilities such as the oil tanks. And also for the shipping arrangement, we can also use the existing chemical tankers when we transport the hydrogen. So in that sense, some of the initial cost to start the project can be reduced by utilizing that kind of infrastructure. And that's something we can benefit from LHC technology.
Excellent. Thanks, Hayashi-san. So I'm just going to try and aggregate a few questions together now that have been coming in. There's a few around cost effectiveness of renewables versus then, I guess, conversion to green hydrogen and shipping. So, well, I mean, I can potentially take that and lead into a follow-up question, but I guess from a cost competitiveness perspective, green hydrogen is just a carrier. So it's just, we make the green electron and then we need to put the green electron into a different format for the purposes of shipping somewhere else. So I guess the question around cost competitiveness, that's why direct electrification was on those slides earlier. That will be more cost competitive. The challenge is in the APAC context, we might have excess electrons available in Australia, but we can't adequately ship them today anywhere else because we don't have undersea high voltage interconnections at the moment. So the scalability question and the competitiveness, it's not as competitive as direct electrification, but potentially those solutions are not open to this kind of supply chain up into Singapore. But maybe I'll throw to a follow-on question, which is around, and maybe I might throw this to you, Louis, from a European perspective. How do we actually think about the societal impact around electrification of existing grids that have a higher carbon intensity and the trade-off between potentially making green hydrogen and exporting that somewhere else? Do you think, is there any shifts at the moment and concerns about best use case of green electrons and whether hydrogen has seen in tension with that potentially?
Yeah, I mean, it's a debate that is constantly ongoing in the hydrogen sector. I think, as you've identified, it's more cost efficient and more efficient use of energy to directly electrify something rather than go through the hydrogen steps. And I think that comes out clearly in things like the European Hydrogen Strategy, which emphasize, well, even their strategy for decarbonisation emphasises things like demand reduction, efficiency, and direct electrification where relevant. But there are pieces of the puzzle that simply can't be fully answered with direct electrification. The use of hydrogen in industry already. Some heavy duty vehicles, there's some debate, but heavy duty vehicles, some industrial processes like steel, the production of e-fuels and other fuels that can be used in things like aviation and shipping all need hydrogen and don't work with direct electrification. Plus there's benefits in future for balancing the huge amounts of renewables produced and the huge swings in power supply versus demand that are needed that hydrogen can benefit with. So I think there's an acknowledgement that electrification is more efficient in a European context where you can produce the renewables in the country, but there's limits on renewable build out within country. That's where the import question comes. I think that's similar to the Singaporean context. And also, to get to net zero, there will need to be some hydrogen in the energy system. And so Europe is plowing ahead with its ambition to be ready to do that, and also to try and lead the world with competition from places like the US and China in developing the hydrogen technology to be able to sell it elsewhere and capitalize on that opportunity.
Thanks, Louis. Yeah, and I think that's going to be one of the ongoing discussions here, particularly in geographies like Australia, where we do have a very carbon intensive current electricity grid. And how do we actually build scale for potential export of green hydrogen at the same time as decarbonising our own grid? So that was I guess it's an easy question. It's a bit more of a difficult answer. Okay, there's one here around policy support, which I might first throw to you, Jia Long, just as a heads up. So the suggestion is that, you know, countries that take a position early in a good hydrogen policy and getting some support mechanisms in place will enjoy a first mover advantage. And just whether or not you think that holds, or whether, you know, a first mover might actually then lead to a series of fast followers, and therefore that first competitive movement may not be so beneficial to whoever wants to strike first. Any comments to that?
Yeah, not all countries are the same, right? So one of the points of hydrogen is that it allows the export of renewable energy from one country to another. So the policy clarity or support would bring different values to different countries. So if an exporting country, I think, would probably benefit more than an importing one. And if like exporting countries could be very clear and set very clear policies to support the initial startup or kickstart of the hydrogen supply, then they would probably be able to get some lock-ins of early off-takers, and that would be, I'm speculating here, but it would be really beneficial to the first movers. For importing countries like Singapore, I think the help needed from policy is to be very clear on some of the definitions, like what was discussed earlier, what's considered green or low carbon, and providing such clarity, I think, would really pave the way for, you know, investors or producers from other countries to send that hydrogen into the Singapore market. Yeah.
Thanks, Jia Long. Maybe as a follow-up, Louis, and this is maybe about what sort of policies might be out there already and what sort of policies might be starting to get a bit of attention. Maybe we'll leave the US Inflation Reduction Act to one side for the minute, but perhaps, Louis, the H2 Global framework that Germany's developing, which is a contract for difference, essentially meaning that that scheme will fund the difference between conventional ammonia, for example, and green ammonia to incentivize investment and make sure that the end user is not going to be on the hook for the increased cost base. Just wondering, have you seen that create some really interesting incentives in Europe? And do you think that kind of model could be replicated elsewhere as at least an opportunity to kickstart the process here in other geographies?
Yeah, it's a very good question and a very relevant program. For a bit of context on how the H2 Global scheme works before I dive back to the question of learnings from it. The H2 Global scheme is led by the German government and is essentially a way to get imports to Germany started. And the way the scheme works, there's an organization that the H2 Global organization, there's a specific name for the company, I think it's called HINT, HINT.co, will tender for hydrogen supply on 10-year contracts from somewhere else in the world. Now, their first program they're running, which is almost the demonstration program, is tendering for green ammonia, green e-methanol, and green sustainable aviation fuels. They lead a call for a supply of each of those fuels, and they have 30 million euros per year per fuel available, and tender for those on a 10-year supply contract. Pick the most competitive project based on cost, likelihood of delivery, project maturity. They then stand behind that 10-year contract, and on 1-year contracts, tender on the other side for the highest price people are willing to bid to use that fuel. So a great mechanism from a producer's perspective. They get 10-year contract for their hydrogen supply, allows them to build projects, and from the offtake perspective, they're not committing to 10 years of something they don't fully, something new to them, this green supply chain. But through the tendering mechanism for the lowest cost supply and the highest price offtaker, the government funding is aimed to be minimized. And that's getting things going. The scheme isn't fully formed. They ended their consultation on forming it on the 10th of August this year. So we haven't yet seen the actual impact of this the first auction round, but will lead to large-scale ammonia, e-methanol, and SAF projects that they're importing into Germany. And beyond that, presumably once the German government decides that the technology is ready for larger scale, there'll be similar tenders for green hydrogen, taking it through vectors such as ammonia or OHC. I mean,
sorry, you can finish. I thought you were wrapping.
Go on. I was trying to tie back to a question because all I've done is explain H2 Global. What can be learned in APAC? First of all, I mean, it's the perfect scheme from the perspective of hydrogen suppliers. You create one of those schemes, you will get hydrogen producers and users buying into it because it offers them such an attractive perspective. One thing it doesn't fully give you is I'll maybe talk about alternative ways that hydrogen projects are getting going in Europe, which is people like your conventional energy companies creating big hydrogen projects to meet their own industrial hydrogen demands. So they're able to draw on CapEx funding, kind of the regulation around hydrogen use in industry, to build these big electrolyzers without a third party sitting in the middle, because they need to decarbonize the refinery and they want hydrogen to be a future, and they can just pump lots of hydrogen to replace their refinery hydrogen with the right policy incentives and CapEx funding that's in place. So that's kind of the contrasting model. Both of them, I think, have their advantages.
Excellent. Maybe, I don't want to put Jia Long on the spot since he works for a government agency about contracts for difference, but maybe Hayashi-san, do you have any views on contract for difference kind of mechanisms in and around APAC, and whether you think they could be applicable here?
Yeah, so maybe I can add a little bit to what Luis explained. The mechanism like H2 Global is it's very important to expedite the commercialization phase of the project. And like in Japan, Japanese government is also contemplating to introduce a mechanism similar to H2 Global or the CFD in the UK, United Kingdom, and so they're looking to have some new framework to support the decarbonization effort. But for the H2 Global, I just want to mention that maybe as Luis mentioned, the hydrogen was not included in the first round of the auction. And I think this was because there are several reasons for sure, but my understanding is that one of the reasons is that there could be some challenge around the transportation between the port and the actual demand side. Is an individual issue which the auction may not be able to handle at this point of time. So this issue of inland transportation is not only in Europe but also in everywhere, and it is another challenge to overcome, I think. And I think that the pipeline option can be a good solution when there's an existing one or enough demand, after the market grows. But until the market is established, the off-takers who can actually buy a green hydrogen could be limited to those who can access. So that was just a comment. Yeah, thank you.
No, excellent. I mean, even though it's a faraway place, Germany, than from where most of us are sitting, that's certainly got the attention of particularly a number of Australian producers to understand how they might be able to sell into the European markets with that kind of support mechanism, which, by the way, will potentially facilitate the building out of a supply chain. And if that is developed, then Singapore is an easier stopover, by the way, once the supply chain is in place. So it may actually benefit the region, even if it's actually being catalysed from a faraway geography. So I think we're probably almost at time for the questions. Thank you to all those that sent them through that we didn't quite get to. Hopefully we've had enough of a dialogue there to cover most. Super interesting for me, always great to hear what's going on out there. Perhaps we might just wrap with a little bit of a presentation or a wrap from each of the speakers on what they think the key takeaways from today and what they see as the key opportunities in the near term, so that we can actually start to work out how to catalyse this opportunity. I might ask Jia Long, you to go first.
Hi, thanks, Justin. So I think we're getting the sense that hydrogen may be the smallest element on the periodic table, but a full global hydrogen supply chain is, like you mentioned earlier, an endeavor that's too big for any one entity to take on by themselves. So I think the time has come for more collaboration, private, public, and even government to government or within the private sector to each put their best foot forward and kickstart this global hydrogen supply chain. Yeah. Not to get ahead of myself, but for the Singapore International SIEW Singapore International Energy Week this year, last year was what we call the year of electricity import, and it could very well be that this year is the year of hydrogen.
No, that's good, and we'll make a reference to that shortly about what's happening in a few weeks in Singapore. Thanks, Jia Long. I might throw to you next, Louis, for your faraway view of what you think might assist in us making this move down here.
Sure. I mean, I think from a lot of the discussion today, it's clear that there's lots of companies interested in developing hydrogen supply chains, particularly global ones, people in Australia, Middle East, kind of partly triggered by Europe, which gives this opportunity, as you mentioned, for Singapore and APAC to piggyback off some of those projects and get hydrogen imported too. As Hayashi-san has said, and you yourself have said, Justin, the supply chain elements have been demonstrated and are ready to be tested at a much larger scale. But despite that, I mean, you have these pieces in place, people willing to produce and own the supply chain. The technology has been tested. The one piece that is missing and will kind of define where hydrogen goes and if it plays a major role in those economies prior to 2030 is the clear policy space and incentives for users and producers to be selling to a particular market. And that policy really needs to be being developed now, like I said, to have any meaningful impact ahead of 2030, given some of the lead times on these projects.
Excellent. Thanks, Louis. And Hayashi-san, your views on a few key takeaways and what we need to be focusing on right now?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so thanks very much. Yeah, I think as everyone pointed out, some kind of support from the government is essential for this stage of the development. But at the I think maybe it's a little bit far from the work, but what we do in work, this may take time. But I think the final beneficiaries are people like us. I mean, people like us or you, yourselves, and I think the ultimate question for this green readiness is, are we ready? For example, are we ready to pay green premium to the higher green premium to electricity bills, or when you buy clothes, can you pay the green premium for that? And I think the government for sure has a role to guide us, but also ourselves are also responsible to think, prepare answers to those questions.
No, that's great. So that's been fantastic. It's been a great dialogue. I could chat for another hour, but I don't think we actually have enough time, and my timekeepers might be onto my case if I try and extend it any longer. I guess it's, if I'm trying to draw all that together in the discussion that we've had today, where that's pointing us, it sounds like there's lots of interesting little bits and pieces out there, some European frameworks that were initiated 2 or 3 years ago that are already catalysing investment in, hundreds of megawatts of electrolyser installations over the next number of years. And it's not something we've really seen other than China, where they have got quite a few hundreds of megawatts of scale, but there's certainly not anything of that scale yet been announced at an investment level decision, certainly in Australia, in the near future, hoping that some of those do get announced. But yeah, I think the key bit here is that we still need to think about the supply chains, and potentially we could probably name all the key players in terms of the development of the big production facilities. We can name a number of players that are potentially taking positions in the end use case, whether that be country-wide or individual players in a country. Clearly Mitsubishi and Tohru are taking a position in how they might be able to develop a supply chain there, but clearly all of these pieces need to come together at the same time to make sure that we can actually not only make the product, but ship it around the place. And yeah, as we said right at the very start, there's 90 million tonne today. That will clearly decrease over time as the requirement for hydrogen for petrochemical refining reduces. But at the same time, if we're only in the 500,000 kind of range, even in another 5 years, there's still plenty of upside there, provided we can get the commercials and the economics to potentially align with the requirements from policy support, at least in the short term, to get things up and running. So that's been great. I've really enjoyed hosting. Thanks to my fellow panelists, Louis, Jia Long, Hayashi-san. Also a shout out to Sophia Ong and Parachute, who have been helping behind the scenes here, making everything roll along. I do think we've got 1 or 2 slides next for those that, thank you for hanging around, are still here. So yeah, Jia Long mentioned this briefly. Just a quick note that Singapore International Energy Week is coming up at the end of the month. A number of you potentially will be there. I will happily be up there along with one of my ERM colleagues from ERM Australia, Michael Ottaviano, and we'll be facilitating a couple of panel sessions when we're up there. And as mentioned by Jia Long, potentially this year is actually all about hydrogen, potentially. And I know the focus today has been on green hydrogen. There's obviously all of those other vectors there, but there are specific work groups and work streams going on, of which I'm involved in, as I said, directly around the green hydrogen activity specifically, including how the role that policymakers might need to take in making sure that that can all come together and take our positions. So I think we're almost at time, and I think that's it in terms of the slides. So one ask from us is, if you could, I'll leave this up a little bit, it would be great if we could get some feedback. Obviously we had a number of questions that we could answer. Was the topic aligned with what you were hoping to hear today? As promised at the start, potentially we don't have all the answers, but we certainly have an interesting discussion based on the questions. But yeah, we'd really appreciate it if you could get in there with your smartphone there, pick up the survey and give us some useful feedback, and hope to be back in the coming weeks or months to host something similar, maybe on another hot topic of the day. I'll leave it up for a little bit longer, but thank you all again for joining. It's been great to host, and look forward to maybe seeing a number of you in person. Certainly, Jia Long, I will see you at the end of the month, and Hayashi-san, perhaps you too. Thanks again to the panelists. Thanks again for the coordination behind the scenes, and I will wrap it up. Have a good day, afternoon, or evening.